exactly is cochlear implant? A cochlear implant is an electronic medical device. It does not work the way a hearing aid works. A hearing aid amplifies sound. It makes existing sound louder. A cochlear implant does something different. It bypasses the damaged or absent parts of the inner ear entirely and delivers electric signals directly to the auditory nerve. The brain then learns over time to interpret these signals as sound. The device has two parts. One is surgically implanted inside the skull behind the ear under the skin. The other is worn externally, a processor, a microphone and a transmitter that sits on the head. Together they create a sensory experience that is often described as functional hearing, though it is not the same as natural hearing. Sounds are processed differently. Music, for instance, is one of the areas where cochlear implant users frequently report difficulty. The richness and tonal variations that hearing people take for granted often does not translate well through the device. The cochlear implant was developed over several decades with early clinical trials in the 1970s and broader approval in the 1980s and 1990s. In India, it has been available since the 1990s and is currently one of the most expensive medical devices accessible in the country. A single cochlear implant system can cost anywhere between rupees 6 lakh to rupees 15 lakhs, and that is before surgery, hospitalization and the years of intensive auditory verbal therapy that must follow for the device to function effectively. The surgery itself carries risks. It is performed on the cochlea, the spiral-shaped structure in the inner ear responsible for converting vibrations into nerve signals. Once implanted, any residual natural hearing in that ear is often permanently destroyed. This is not a side effect that can be reversed. If the device fails or if the user decides later in life that they do not wish to use it, the hearing that existed before the surgery cannot be recovered. Now, with that context in place, let me introduce something that might be surprising to some of you. There exists in many parts of the world, including India, though less visibly so, a community of people who are not waiting for cochlear implants, who do not consider deafness a medical condition to be corrected, who have a language, a history, a literature, and a set of social institutions and political identity. The community is referred to with a capital D as the deaf community, and the distinction between capital D and a lowercase d matters enormously. Lowercase d deaf refers to the audiological condition. It describes a person who cannot hear or cannot hear within a particular range. It is a medical classification. Capital D deaf refers to a cultural identity. A deaf person in the sense is someone who identifies with the community that uses sign language as its primary language, that has shared norms and values, and that understands deafness is not an absence or loss, but as a different way of being in this world. Michelle Friedner, in her ethnographic work on deaf communities in Bangalore, put it plainly. Deaf people are not simply people who cannot hear, they are people who have built a world together, and that world had its own logic, its own pleasure, its own forms of belonging, and understands deafness not absence or loss, but as a different way of being in the world. The scholar and activist Harlan Lane, who spent decades working on deaf history and rights, described deaf culture as having all the characteristics we associate with any ethnic or linguistic minority: a shared language, shared institutions, intermarriage, a sense of group identity, and a history of external oppression. Sign languages are not simplified versions of spoken language expressed with the hands. They are complete, grammatically sophisticated, fully expressive languages that are entirely distinct from the spoken languages of the country in which they are developed. American Sign Language is not English. British Sign Language is not American Sign Language. Indian Sign Language has its own grammar, its own vocabulary, its own regional variation. These are real languages and their users are bilingual in a genuine sense when they also read or write in a spoken language. So what does this have to do with cochlear implants? When a cochlear implant is given to a young deaf child, especially a child born to hearing parents, which is the case for approximately 90% of deaf children, what often happens is that a medical decision is being made before the child has any capacity to participate in it. The child cannot consent, and the decision being made is not just a medical one, it is a cultural and linguistic one. The implant requires years of oral training, learning to interpret the signals the device sends and to produce spoken language. This process is intensive and time consuming, and during those years, many children receive little or no exposure to sign language because some audiologists and some families believe that learning sign language will interfere with the development of spoken language. The research on this is, to put it plainly, not conclusive. Many researchers argue that sign language does not impede oral development and may in fact support it. But the belief persists, and the consequence is that implanted children are frequently raised without access to language of the deaf community. Friedner describes this as a form of productive exclusion. A child is made productive within the hearing world precisely by being cut off from the deaf one. To a hearing parent, this may seem unremarkable. If the child is going to learn to hear and speak, why would they need sign language? But think about what this means from the perspective of the deaf community. What is being said implicitly is that deaf culture is not worth transmitting, that the language of the community, Indian Sign Language, ASL, BSL, is not a real language worth learning, that the community itself is something to be escaped from if the right technology is available. The cochlear implant is perhaps the most contested terrain on which technoableism has played out in the past 40 years. When cochlear implants began to be offered to deaf children in large numbers in the 1980s and 1990s, the response from deaf communities in the United States and Europe was not of enthusiasm, it was alarm. The National Association of the Deaf in the United States issued a position statement expressing deep concern about the implantation of young children. They argued that deafness was not a pathology requiring a cure, that the medical profession was making a cultural and linguistic decision, the erasure of deaf community membership by presenting it as a pure medical one, that children deserved the opportunity to grow, learn their options and make this decision for themselves. The response from the medical establishment was largely dismissive. Parents were told that the window for optimal auditory development was narrow, that if the surgery was not done early, often by age 2 or 3, the benefits would be reduced. The delay was itself a kind of harm. The urgency was medical, the framework was clinical, and the voices of the deaf community were treated as the special pleading of a group with a vested interest. What rarely happened in those early conversations was this, that the deaf community was not arguing against technology per se. They were arguing against the assumption that deafness was a problem that needed solving and that cochlear implants were the solution that rendered all other considerations secondary. Paddy Ladd, a British deaf activist and academic, coined the term deafhood to describe the experience of becoming and being deaf in a world structured by hearing norms. He argued that deaf people had spent centuries being told that their way of being was deficient, that their language was not a real language, that their community was a community of impairment rather than culture. Cochlear implant technology arrived within that long history, and to understand why it was received with such complexity, you have to know that history. Let me bring this into the Indian context. India has estimated 6.3 crore people with some form of hearing impairment, making it one of the largest populations of deaf and hard hearing individuals in the world. The Indian Sign Language, developed over decades through deaf schools and communities, was officially recognized as a language in 2023, a significant but long overdue acknowledgement. ISL has around 5 lakh users, a small number relative to the overall deaf population, which tells us something about how many deaf people in India have not had access to this language or to the communities around it. The cochlear implant in this context is almost entirely a technology of the urban middle class. At rupees 6 to 15 lakhs for the device alone, before surgery, before rehabilitation, before ongoing maintenance, it is simply not accessible to the vast majority of deaf people in India. The government's assistance to disabled persons scheme and some state programs do provide subsidies, but coverage is uneven and the process of accessing them is long. What this means in practice is that cochlear implants in India are heavily concentrated among families who have resources, who live near major medical centers, who can afford the years of speech therapy afterward. And yet, the cultural narrative around cochlear implants, the miracle video, the media coverage, presents them as a solution for deafness in general, as if the device were the answer to a universal problem. Friedner's research in urban India found that for many middle class families, the cochlear implant had become less a medical choice than a social one, a signal of aspiration, of being the kind of family that does everything possible, that does not accept limitation. What gets hidden in that presentation is the gap between who the technology claims to serve and who it actually reaches. A cochlear implant in Mumbai in a family with access to regular follow-up is a very different experience from what it is possible for a child in a rural district where the nearest audiologist is hours away and where the auditory verbal therapy required for the device to work is simply not available. And Indian Sign Language? It is rarely offered as an alternative. In many schools for the deaf in India, the medium of instruction has historically been spoken language, a pedagogical choice rooted in the same logic that drives cochlear implant advocacy, that deaf children should be brought to as close to hearing norms as possible. Sign language in this framework is a fallback, a consolation, not a first language, not a full language, not a choice worth making. This is where the stories we tell about technology do start to do their work. The cochlear implant activation video is now one of the most reliably viral formats on the internet. A child hears for the first time. A grandmother hears a child's voice. A teenager reacts to music. These videos are real. The emotion in them is real. I'm not asking you to dismiss that emotion, but I'm asking you to notice what the narrative is doing. These videos are structured around a single before and after. Before silence, absence, deficit. After sound, connection, wholeness. The cochlear implant is the hinge. And the story ends when the device is switched on, as if what follows, the years of work, the uncertain outcomes, the moments when the device fails or is uncomfortable, the question of who the person becomes is not part of the story. What is also not part of the story is the child who grows up with the implant and at 17 or 22 discovers the deaf community for the first time, learns sign language and begins to understand that there was a world they were not given access to, that this too is a real outcome. That it happens with enough regularity, that it has a name in deaf community circles, late deafened or oral deaf identity, and that it is accompanied in many cases by genuine grief for a community and a language that was withheld. This is not an argument that cochlear implants are bad. This is not what I am asking you to conclude. There are cochlear implant users who are deeply glad for the device, who feel it has enriched their lives, who identify as hearing or hard of hearing, not as deaf, and who do not feel that anything was taken from them. Those accounts are real. They deserve to be heard. The point is not that one outcome is right and the other is wrong. The point is that the dominant narrative, the miracle video, the news article, the well-meaning relative saying this will change everything presents only one version of that story as valid. And in doing so, it makes it harder for families to make genuine informed decisions. It makes it harder to hear the other stories. It makes the deaf community's concerns sound like obstruction rather than expertise. Susan Mendel, whose work on the rejected body has been foundational in disability studies, writes that the medicine often pathologizes conditions that are not in themselves experiences of suffering. They become experiences of suffering through the social world that surrounds them. A deaf child does not suffer because they cannot hear. They may suffer because the world is built for hearing people, because they are excluded, because their language is not taught in schools, because their community is invisible to them. The suffering is real, but locating its source in the ear rather than in the world is a choice, and it is a choice with consequences. When we locate the problem in the body, the solution is medical. When we locate the problem in the world, the solution is political. Cochlear implants are a medical solution, accessible education in Indian Sign Language, recognition of ISL as a medium of instruction, investment in deaf schools and deaf-led institutions, public communication in sign language. These are political solutions, and they serve a far larger population than cochlear implants ever could. Technoableism in this context does something precise. It makes the medical solution seem obvious, inevitable and compassionate, and it makes the political solution seem secondary, as if the infrastructure and recognition will follow once enough deaf children have learned to hear. But the infrastructure rarely follows. The schools do not improve because the surgeries happen. Sign language is not taught because the implants become cheaper. These are separate problems that require separate attention, and the dominance of the cochlear implant narrative actively displaces that attention. It is worth pausing here to ask, what does it mean for a community to be told that the best outcome for its children is to no longer belong to that community? This is not a hypothetical question. It is a question that deaf people have been asking with increasing force and political organization for 40 years. And it sits uncomfortably alongside other histories. Histories of children taken from indigenous communities to be educated in the language and culture of the majority. Histories of minority languages suppressed in the name of integration. Histories where well-meaning intervention and cultural erasure were not as far apart as we might like to think. This is not to say that cochlear implantation is equivalent to those histories. It is to say that when we are deciding what is best for a child who belongs to a minority community, before that child can speak for themselves, we should be honest about how many times that sentence has preceded harm. The deaf community is not asking to be left behind. They are asking to be treated as a community with knowledge, with culture, with expertise about their own lives. When a deaf adult says that their deafness is not a tragedy, that is not denial, that is information. When a deaf-led organization says that cochlear implants should not be offered to pre-linguistic children without informed consent, processes that include deaf community voices, that is not opposition to technology, that is a demand for ethical practice. As Friedner argued, the problem is not that deaf people are resistant to medicine, it is that medicine rarely found it necessary to be curious about them. So what is the alternative? First, to separate the technology from the certainty that surrounds it. Cochlear implants can be a meaningful option for some deaf people in some circumstances. They are not a miracle. They are a device with specific capabilities, specific limitations, specific costs, and specific outcomes that vary significantly across individuals. Second, to insist that informed consent for cochlear implantation of children include genuine exposure to deaf culture and sign language, not as an afterthought, but as a part of the decision. Parents who are making this choice on behalf of their children deserve to know that there is a community, a language, a way of life that the surgery may make harder to access. Third, to invest in what cochlear implant narratives displaces. Indian Sign Language education in school, training for sign language interpreters, public broadcast of in ISL, recognition of ISL as an official language of instruction. These are rights and they serve everyone. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, to hold the space for the possibility that hearing is not the only way of being fully human. That a person can live a rich, connected, expressive, meaningful life in sign language without cochlear implants, without spoken language, and that this is not a lesser life. The question is not how close to hearing we can bring deaf people, but what conditions would allow deaf and deaf people to live life on their own terms.